The balloons were the color of a sunrise that never arrived, gold and amber, tied in perfect clusters along the garden fence of the Crane estate in Rosedale. And by 4 o'clock, not one child from Miles Crane's class had come to stand beneath them. Nathaniel Crane watched from behind the tall library windows, his tie already loosened though the party hadn't properly begun. Below him, the caterers kept arranging trays of food no one would eat, and the little band he'd flown in from Montreal tuned their instruments for an audience of one. Nathaniel had spent 3 weeks organizing this birthday, Miles's 9th, down to the smallest detail, as though enough gold balloons and enough sugar could undo what the last year had taken from his son. Since the accident that claimed Margaret's life on an icy stretch of the Gardiner Expressway, Miles hadn't spoken a single word out loud. It wasn't that he couldn't. The doctors had been clear about that after the surgery. To save what remained of his hearing, Miles could still form sounds if he wanted to, though the world now reached him only through vibration, expression, and the careful shapes of hands. He had learned American Sign Language faster than anyone expected, faster than his own father, who fumbled through his lessons with Priya, the young interpreter Nathaniel had hired to help them both. But learning to sign hadn't made the other 9-year-olds any less afraid of a boy who couldn't hear them laugh. Mr. Crane, Mrs. Kaminsky, who had managed the household for 11 years and had known Margaret since her days as a hopeful chemist with paint still under her fingernails, stood in the doorway with her clipboard pressed to her chest. Another cancellation. That makes 14. They're likely stuck on the Don Valley, Nathaniel said, not turning from the window. Traffic on a Saturday. Mrs. Kaminsky didn't answer. They both knew it wasn't traffic. It was the awkward silence that fell over classroom parents whenever Miles's name came up. The quiet unwillingness to explain to their own children how to talk to a boy who talked with his hands. Not cruelty, exactly. Something closer to fear, dressed up as caution. Nathaniel found Miles in his room a few minutes later, sitting very still by the window in the blue soccer jersey he'd chosen that morning, watching the empty street the way a person watches for a bus that has already passed. His father signed, slow and careful, the way Priya had taught him. Ready? Miles looked at him and signed back, small and certain. Nobody's coming. They will, Nathaniel said aloud, forgetting himself, then caught his son's eyes and signed it too, though his hands shook slightly on the last word. By the second hour, the string quartet had switched to something quieter, almost apologetic, and the magician, imported at considerable expense from a viral video Miles had watched 40 times, was folding up his props with the practiced grace of a man used to disappointment that wasn't his own. Miles sat in the middle of the empty garden, beneath the useless, beautiful balloons, and did not cry. That was somehow worse than if he had. It was Mrs. Kaminsky who came to Nathaniel first, her brow furrowed in confusion rather than alarm. "Sir, there's a girl at the gate, not on the list. She says she saw the balloons from the street." The girl was perhaps 11, with dark hair escaping a braid and a canvas bag slung across her chest that smelled, even from a distance, of something warm and freshly baked. Her sneakers were patched at the toe with electrical tape, the kind of careful repair that spoke of a family stretching every dollar as far as it would go. She looked at the balloons the way other children looked at fireworks. "Hi," she said, when Nathaniel came to the gate himself, unsure why he hadn't simply sent Mrs. Kaminsky to turn her away. "I'm Noemi. I was bringing my grandma her pan de sal, that's bread from the Filipino bakery on Gerard, and I saw the balloons over the fence. They're really pretty. Is it somebody's birthday?" Nathaniel should have said the party was private. Instead, he found himself glancing back at his son, small and solitary among the decorations, and something in his chest simply gave way. "It is," he said. "Would you like to come in?" Noemi didn't hesitate the way careful children were taught to. She crossed the lawn with the confidence of someone who had never once thought a party wasn't for her, and stopped in front of Miles's wheelchair-free but silent world, studying his face with open curiosity rather than pity. "Happy birthday," she said, and then, without waiting for an answer she somehow already understood wouldn't come the usual way, she raised both hands and made a clumsy, entirely wrong sign for happy. Fingers splayed, moving upward too fast. Miles's whole face changed. He laughed, a real laugh, silent but unmistakable, shoulders shaking, and corrected her with patient, exaggerated hands. "No, like this." Noemi copied him, got it right the second time, and grinned like she'd won something. Nathaniel stood frozen at the edge of the lawn. His son had not laughed like that, had not looked like that in over a year. "You know sign language?" Nathaniel asked her, when Noemi turned to him mid-lesson. "A little. My cousin Benny is deaf. He taught me some before his family moved to Winnipeg." She shrugged, matter of fact. "I forget a lot of it, though. Miles could teach me the rest if he wants." Miles was already signing, hands flying now, and Noemi was watching his fingers with the fierce concentration of someone determined not to miss a word, laughing when she got it wrong, asking him to slow down, asking him to show her again. By the time the pastry chef brought out the cake, a fire truck, because Miles had wanted to be a firefighter before the accident and still did quietly, in the way children hold on to old dreams, Noemi had pulled a small paper-wrapped loaf from her bag and pressed it into Nathaniel's hands. "My grandma says nobody should come to a party without bringing something," she explained. "It's not fancy. It's still warm, though." Something about the warmth of that bread, ordinary and unglamorous in a garden that had cost more than most Toronto salaries to landscape, undid the careful composure Nathaniel had been holding since Margaret died. He sat down on the grass in his tailored jacket, ruining the knees of trousers that cost more than Noemi's family likely paid in rent, and let his son teach a stranger the alphabet in sign, one letter at a time, both children collapsing into silent, shaking laughter every time Noemi mixed up F and T. By evening, when Noemi's mother had to be called, and Mrs. Kaminsky drove her home to Scarborough with a container of leftover cake balanced on her lap, Miles refused to let go of her hand until the very last second. "Tomorrow," he signed at the car window. Noemi signed back, careful and slow, showing off what she'd learned in a single afternoon. "Tomorrow?" That night, for the first time since the funeral, Miles asked. In his hands, urgent and clear, for his father to read to him before bed, something he'd stopped wanting months ago. Nathaniel sat beside him, signing his way clumsily through half a picture book about fire trucks, and did not check his phone once, though it buzzed steadily with messages about tomorrow's board meeting. Later, alone in his study with the lights of the CN Tower blinking faintly through the window, Nathaniel poured a glass of the wine Margaret used to keep for good news and thought about all the specialists, all the therapies, all the perfectly engineered birthday parties he'd thrown at the problem of his son's grief, none of which had worked half as well as one girl with a loaf of bread and no fear of silence. His phone rang near midnight. An unfamiliar number, a woman's voice, warm and slightly out of breath. "Mr. Crane, this is Corazon Reyes, Noemi's grandmother. I hope it isn't too late. She only just told me where she'd been all afternoon, and I wanted to be sure it was all right that she stayed." "Mrs. Reyes," Nathaniel said, surprising himself with how easily the warmth came, "your granddaughter gave my son more joy today than a year of doctors managed. She's welcome any time she likes. She has that gift," Corazon said quietly. "Even in our little apartment, she fills every corner." After he hung up, Nathaniel made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the man he'd been that morning. Tomorrow, after the board meeting, he would drive out to Scarborough and see with his own eyes the world that had made a girl like Noemi. The Crane Therapeutics boardroom on the 40th floor hummed with the particular tension of people who had already decided what they wanted and were merely waiting for permission to say it out loud. 12 executives sat around a table of dark walnut, and at the head of it, half listening to the quarterly numbers, sat Nathaniel, still faintly smelling of the pain de sal he hadn't been able to bring himself to wash off his hands. Gareth Whitfield, the company's chairman, cleared his throat as the CFO, Lorraine Voss, finished her presentation. "In short," Whitfield said, folding his hands, "the Rare and Undeserved Conditions Division is bleeding capital without producing anything marketable. The board is recommending a 60% cut, effective this quarter." That division had been Margaret's. She'd built it herself, back when she still had a lab coat and paint under her nails instead of a corner office, determined to develop treatments for the patients too few to matter to a shareholder report. Insulin analogs for children, whose families couldn't afford the name-brand kind. Medications, reformulated to cost less without costing less in effect. "That division isn't meant to turn a profit for another 4 years, Nathaniel said. "That was the agreement from the start." "That agreement," Voss said carefully, "was made under different circumstances. A polite way, Nathaniel understood, of saying when your wife was alive and you still cared about anything besides quarterly earnings." The division stays funded, Nathaniel said. Next item. He won that round, barely, and knew as he left the boardroom that it was only a stay of execution. The drive to Scarborough took less than half an hour, but felt, as it always did for people who never made the trip, like crossing into another country entirely. The glass towers gave way to strip malls, the strips to modest brick apartment blocks with laundry lines strung between balconies and window boxes crowded with tomato plants fighting for October sun. Children rode bicycles patched together from spare parts along a street where neighbors called greetings to one another in Tagalog, Tamil, and English, all at once. Corazon Reyes answered the door of apartment 4B with silver hair, pulled into a neat knot and eyes that matched her granddaughter's exactly, in color and in directness. "Mr. Crane," she said, "Noemi said you might come. Please sit." The apartment was small and immaculate, filled with the smell of adobo simmering somewhere, and the particular warmth of a home where every wall held a photograph or a framed diploma. Through an open door, Nathaniel glimpsed Noemi's tiny bedroom, its desk buried under science homework and drawings of fire trucks with wings. "Your granddaughter transformed a very difficult day for my family," Nathaniel said, accepting the tea Corazon poured. "I wanted to thank you properly. The other parents worried about the wheelchair." "No," Corazon caught herself gently. "About his hearing, yes? They fear what confuses them. It's easier to stay away than to learn a new way of listening." "Exactly that," Nathaniel admitted. But Noemi didn't hesitate for a second. "Oh," she noticed, Corazon said, pouring more tea. "She isn't blind to difference. She was simply raised to believe a person's worth has nothing to do with how easily the world accommodates them." They spoke for an hour about Noemi's father, Ramon, who worked long shifts on construction sites across the city, and her mother, Ligaya, a nurse at Toronto General, studying nights for her practitioner's license. Corazon spoke of these things without a trace of self-pity. "We don't have much money," she said simply, "but we have each other, and faith and good bread. In the ways that count, we are rich people." Nathaniel thought of his own house, filled with priceless art that had said nothing to anyone, until a girl with a paper bag walked through the gate. "May I ask about her grandfather?" Nathaniel said, noticing a photograph of a distinguished man in a white coat, surrounded by children in a clinic that was clearly not in Canada. Corazon's whole face softened. "Emmanuel. He was a doctor back in Manila before we came here. A specialist in diabetes care for children whose families had almost nothing. He spent his whole career finding ways to make insulin therapy affordable in places where the name brand cost more than a family's monthly income." Did he publish his work? Extensively, but mostly in Filipino and regional medical journals. He believed medicine belonged to whoever needed it, not only to those who could read the right language in the right country. A shadow crossed her face. The big pharmaceutical companies weren't interested. "No profit in helping people who can't pay full price," they told him. Even here, after we moved, nobody wanted to look at it seriously. Nathaniel felt something twist in his chest, recognition of his own industry's quiet cruelty, wearing a different face this time. The front door burst open before he could respond, and Noemi came in with her backpack still half unzipped. "Grandma, I got an A on my..." She stopped short at the sight of Nathaniel. "Mr. Crane, did you come to take me to see Miles?" "I came to thank your grandmother," Nathaniel said. "And yes, if it's all right, Miles has been asking when you'll visit again." Corazon nodded her permission, and Noemi was already pulling homework from her bag. "I'll finish super fast." While she worked at the kitchen table, Corazon showed Nathaniel more photographs. Emmanuel in a makeshift clinic surrounded by beaming children, boxes of unpublished research still labeled in his careful handwriting, stored in the back room. "He always said," Corazon murmured, "that sometimes the universe puts the right people in the same room at exactly the right time. Perhaps that's what happened at your gate." On the drive back to Rosedale, Noemi pressed her face to the window, narrating every landmark: her school, the community center where she took swimming lessons on Saturdays, the bakery that made the pan de sal. "Mr. Crane," she said suddenly, "does Miles miss his mom a lot?" The question caught him off guard. "Yes, we both do. My friend Alia's dad passed away last year. She was really sad for a long time. But now she can talk about him and smile sometimes too." Noemi considered this. Miles didn't sign anything about his mom yesterday, but maybe someday he will, and it won't hurt so much. Nathaniel had to look out the window himself for a moment before he trusted his voice. "I hope so, sweetheart." Weeks passed, and a new rhythm settled over the Crane house. Noemi came almost every day after school, and the mansion that had echoed with silence for a year now echoed with something else entirely. Laughter, the soft slap of hands signing too fast to keep up with, the scrape of chalk on the driveway where the two of them drew elaborate maps to imaginary places. Miles's bedroom walls, once bare, filled up with drawings Noemi made of the two of them as firefighters, superheroes, astronauts. Miles's silence reframed, in her crayon world, not as a limitation but as a kind of secret code only the two of them shared. Nathaniel found himself leaving the office earlier, arriving home not to quiet but to chaos he'd once have found exhausting and now found himself racing toward. The board, meanwhile, was losing patience. Whitfield called an emergency session on a Tuesday morning, and Nathaniel walked in to find him already seated at the head of the table, Nathaniel's chair. "We're proposing full closure of the Undeserved Conditions Division," Whitfield said without preamble. "Effective immediately. Halcyon Capital has expressed serious interest in acquiring our consumer division at a premium, provided we demonstrate a clear path to margin growth. Halcyon, a firm with a well-documented history of buying companies, gutting research and reselling the pieces. This company is not for sale," Nathaniel said. "That may not be entirely your decision anymore," Whitfield said mildly. "The shareholders vote Friday." Nathaniel had 4 days. That night he sat with Miles, who was tired but happy after a full day of what Noemi called mission planning, some elaborate game involving Miles's chair and an entire fictional rescue squad. Miles signed, slow and thoughtful. "Would Mom like Noemi? She'd love her." Nathaniel signed back. "Your mom always liked people who saw the world differently." "I think Mom is watching from somewhere," Miles signed. "Noemi says maybe the stars." Nathaniel smiled through the ache in his throat. "That's a beautiful thought, buddy." Later, alone in his study, he pulled out a dusty photo album. Margaret, in an old lab coat, grinning over their first small breakthrough, years before Rosedale, before boardrooms, before any of it. They had started the company to heal people, not to become rich. Somewhere the two goals had quietly traded places. He thought of Emmanuel Reyes's boxes of research, gathering dust in a Scarborough closet, because a man with brown skin and a Filipino medical journal credential had never been taken seriously by companies exactly like his own. He worked through the night. The call came the following afternoon, in the middle of a strategy session with his legal team. "Corazon's number, Mr. Crane." Her voice trembled in a way it hadn't before. "I'm at Toronto General. My heart. They say I need surgery right away." "I'm on my way," Nathaniel said, already standing. "Which floor?" "Cardiology." "But Mr. Crane, there's a problem. The medication they need for after, it's called Glucofex, for my blood sugar and my heart both. My insurance won't cover the full course. It's made by—" She stopped. "By Crane Therapeutics," Nathaniel finished quietly. The irony was almost too much to bear. "Don't think about the medication," he told her. "Think about getting through the surgery. I'll take care of everything." Within 20 minutes, he was moving through the hospital corridors and found Noemi sitting very still beside her grandmother's bed, holding her hand with a stillness that didn't suit her at all. "Mr. Crane," she said, standing quickly. "You came?" "Of course I came." He crouched to meet her eyes the way he'd learned to do with Miles, and found himself using it now without thinking. "Your grandmother is strong. She's going to be fine." "What if she isn't?" Noemi's voice cracked on the question she clearly hadn't let herself ask out loud before. "Remember what you taught Miles about the stars," Nathaniel said gently. "How even when something ends, it can become something new. Your grandmother has more stories left to tell. I believe that." While Corazon was in surgery, Nathaniel made calls, first to the hospital pharmacy, ensuring every medication Corazon might need would be covered in full and quietly, with no fanfare attached to it. Then to Ligaya and Ramon, who arrived straight from their shifts, Ramon still in his high-vis vest, dust from a construction site still on his boots. "Mr. Crane," Ramon said, exhausted and wary. "They told us the cost has been handled. We can't accept that." "Please," Nathaniel said, "consider it repayment for the gift your daughter gave my family." The surgeon appeared hours later, still in scrubs. "The procedure went well. She's stable." Relief moved through the small waiting room like a physical thing. Noemi hugged her parents then, unexpectedly, hugged Nathaniel too. When he was allowed a moment alone with Corazon afterward, groggy but clear-eyed in recovery, she took his hand before he could speak. "You saved my life. The doctors did that before they took me in," Corazon said. "I told Noemi something Emmanuel used to say. Even sick, still smile. Kindness keeps growing even after the gardener has gone." She studied him. "Mr. Crane, in the back room there are boxes of Emmanuel's research. Ways to make insulin therapy cost far less without losing any of its power. The big companies weren't interested because it wouldn't make them richer. But in the right hands," Nathaniel said slowly, an idea already taking shape, "it still could help people." Corazon nodded, and a nurse arrived to check her vitals, ending the conversation there. Nathaniel stepped into the hallway and called his head of research. "Annika, I need you to look at something for me tonight. A doctor named Emmanuel Reyes." By the 5th day of Corazon's recovery, Dr. Anika Chowdhury had gone through half of Emmanuel's boxes and called Nathaniel at 7 in the morning, her voice tight with barely contained excitement. "Nathaniel, this is extraordinary work. He found an alternate synthesis pathway that could cut production costs on our insulin line by nearly half without touching efficacy. This isn't theoretical. He ran it in clinics across the Philippines for over a decade. Can we implement it? Within months, not years." Friday's shareholder meeting was packed beyond capacity, the largest Crane Therapeutics had ever held. Halcyon's representatives sat near the front, their expressions carefully neutral, their intentions anything but. Whitfield opened by portraying Nathaniel's continued resistance as sentimentality clouding sound judgment. Nathaniel walked to the podium with nothing but a slim folder. 20 years ago, he began, "My wife and I founded this company on the belief that medicine exists to heal people. All people, not only the ones who represent favorable margins. Somewhere along the way, we drifted from that. I'd like to show you how we find our way back." He clicked to the first slide, Emmanuel Reyes, standing in a modest clinic, surrounded by children whose lives his work had saved. Whitfield stood immediately. "This is not the place for." "It's exactly the place," Nathaniel said, and continued. He laid out the numbers. A projected drop in margin balanced against a dramatic expansion into underserved and rural Canadian communities, a partnership with community health centers from Scarborough to Thunder Bay, dedicated to keeping essential medications within reach of the families who needed them most. The debate raged for over an hour, Whitfield insisting the plan was reckless idealism, Halcyon's representatives murmuring about withdrawing their offer. Then the doors at the back of the room opened. Corazon entered first, supported by Ligaya, still moving carefully but upright and steady. Ramon followed, and behind him, Tommy, carrying a science fair display board under one arm, with Miles beside her in his chair, hands already moving as he took in the size of the room. "Excuse the interruption," Corazon said, with a quiet dignity that silenced even the most restless shareholders. "But I believe we have something to add to this conversation." Noemi stepped forward, setting her display board on an ease someone quickly found for her. It showed, in a careful 11-year-old's handwriting, charts of insulin costs against family incomes across the GTA, statistics she and her mother had gathered from Ligaya's own patients at Toronto General. "My grandpa believed medicine should help everybody, not just people with a lot of money," Noemi said, her voice clear in the hushed room. "He found a way to make it cost less and still work just as well. Nobody wanted to listen to him. I think it's time somebody did." Ligaya spoke next, drawing on years at the hospital bedside, patients rationing insulin, skipping doses to stretch a prescription, the human and financial cost of that quiet daily crisis. Then Corazon, her voice soft but unwavering. "My husband spent his life healing people who couldn't pay for it. He believed medicine was a sacred trust, not only a business. There is room for both a fair profit and an honest conscience. Mr. Crane understands that now. The question is whether the rest of you are willing to understand it too." Miles wheeled himself forward at the end and signed slowly, deliberately, while Priya, who had come with him, spoke the words aloud for the room. "My mom used to say that real success means helping other people succeed too. I think that's what my dad is finally doing." The silence that followed was unlike any Nathaniel had heard in that boardroom before. The vote, when it came, passed with 56% in favor. Whitfield resigned before the meeting had even fully adjourned. Halcyon's representatives left without a word. Afterward, surrounded by the unlikely family that had upended his entire life in the space of a single autumn, Nathaniel felt something close to peace for the first time in over a year. "We did it," he said. "You did it," Corazon corrected gently. Emmanuel would be proud beyond words. 6 months later, Crane Therapeutics had cut production costs on its insulin line by nearly 40%, funding a community access program that had already reached clinics from Scarborough to Sudbury. The stock had wobbled at first, then steadied, then climbed, as patient advocacy groups across the country began asking why other companies couldn't do the same. Ligaya had joined the newly established Reyes Foundation as Director of Community Health, bringing her clinical eye to every partnership they built. Ramon had started night classes toward a construction management certificate, something he'd shelved years earlier for lack of time and money. The Crane House, once a mausoleum of good taste and empty rooms, now rang with noise most afternoons. Miles's wheelchair had been fitted, at his own insistent design, with LED lights and a small dashboard he and Noemi had built together, transforming it, in the endless mythology the two of them had constructed, into the command vessel of an intergalactic rescue squad, its captain's seat the most coveted spot at every playdate. A few of his classmates, tentative at first, had begun learning basic signs just to keep up with him at recess. On a clear October afternoon, almost exactly a year after the party no one had come to, Nathaniel stood on the patio watching Miles and Noemi run a mission briefing for a small crowd of neighborhood kids, teaching them the alphabet in sign, one exaggerated letter at a time. "Quite different from last year," Corazon said, joining him with 2 cups of tea. "In every way that matters," Nathaniel agreed. "I didn't understand back then what makes a house a home, and now I understand it isn't about what you have. It's about who you let in." Across the garden, Miles turned, caught his father's eye, and signed with a grin, "Dad, we need another officer for the Space Council. Emergency mission." Nathaniel laughed and crossed the lawn to join them, taking his assigned role. Deputy Communications Officer, apparently, on account of his still imperfect signing, with mock seriousness that made both children collapse into silent, shaking laughter. That evening, after Noemi had gone home with her grandmother and the garden had emptied of noise, Nathaniel tucked Miles into bed and sat for a moment at the edge of it, watching his son's eyes grow heavy with the particular satisfaction of a good day. "Dad," Miles signed, slow with sleep, "I think Mom would like how things are now." "I think so too, buddy," Nathaniel signed back. "Noemi says the best families are sometimes the ones we choose," Miles continued. "Like how her grandma and grandpa weren't even from the same country, but they became family anyway." Nathaniel smoothed the blanket over his son's shoulders, thinking of all the specialists and therapies and perfectly orchestrated parties he'd once believed could fix what grief had broken, and how none of it had come close to one girl's loaf of warm bread and her refusal to be afraid of silence. "Love doesn't disappear," he said softly, signing it too, though Miles's eyes were already closing. "It just becomes something new, like your stars." Miles drifted off with a small smile still on his face, and Nathaniel stood at the window a long while afterward, looking out over a city that had taught him, in the end, that the most powerful kind of healing rarely comes from a laboratory at all. That sometimes it begins with nothing more than the courage to open a gate to a stranger and let her in.